Hello, everyone. I am Dr. Georgiana Stanciu, Curator at the Royal Canadian Regiment Museum. Happy to welcome you to our first curated tour. Today's topic is the South African War, and to accompany us in this live guided tour, we have invited Professor Gordon Heath from McMaster Divinity College. Before moving on, I will go over the Zoom protocol arrangements, and as you might have seen, the meeting is recorded. If you have questions, please put them in the chat box, and they will be addressed at the end. After this brief introduction, just so you have an overview of how our meeting will unfold, Professor Gordon Heath will talk about the South African War, its causes, its deployment and consequences. Followed by the live tour in our museum's gallery dedicated to this section. And at the end, I have brought from the archives section of our collection a number of unique material that I thought would be very appropriate for this little tour. Before we start, I just want to recognize our public programmer Sarah Coates, who is in the behind the scenes, just taking care of the technical arrangements. So let's begin with Professor Gordon Heath from McMaster Divinity College. Professor Heath has contributed to our programming before. Oddly enough, he was the last public event that we held at the Royal Canadian Regiment Museum in February 2020. And as it turns out, he has contributed to our RCRM Speaker Series Season 1 and Season 2. And he is now back to briefly present the South African War. Professor Heath, to you.
Great, thank you. Thank you for the invitation. I'm going to do a screen share of PowerPoint slides. There we go. So the South African War has many different titles. You can see the dates on the PowerPoint, 1899 to 1902. It's sometimes called the Anglo-Boer War, the Second Anglo-Boer War. And if you're from South Africa, you may have other names for it. But we'll call it the South African War or the Boer War. Sometimes I flip back and forth between titles. But you see the dates. It starts in October 1899 and finishes in 1902, May of 1902. So it's a very long war, almost 2.5 years long. And so a very significant war in the history of South Africa and for the British Empire in particular. You can see on the map, the light brown territory with the Union Jack is the territory of the British Empire at the time, and the two small Boer republics, Transvaal Republic and Orange Free State. And it's the conflicts between the light brown and the orange, those two republics. You can see that they're sort of being swallowed up by the British. And so they will be swallowed up by the British, and that's part of the point of the war. But it's the South African War. And you say, what does Boer mean? Well, Boer means farmer. And those who arrived in South Africa were Dutch, originally back in the early 1800s. Eventually, the British took over after the Napoleonic Wars. And then many of the Boers, the farmers, moved northeast into inland, and eventually, through conquest, established two republics. And they're called the Transvaal Republic and the Orange Free State. And so the conflict is between the British expansion of their empire against these two Dutch Boer republics. And so let's go through. I'm going to look at causes, conflict, and consequences. And if you have any questions after, happy to deal with those. And so I really want to give us just a quick sense of this war that not many have actually heard of, or if they have heard of it, don't really know much about it. And so hopefully by the end of 10 minutes, we'll have a sense of this very important conflict in Canadian history. This is the first war that Canada sends troops to overseas. And so it's a pretty significant moment in Canadian history. If you want to do further reading on the war, Carmen Miller's Painting the Map Red is the standard classic work on Canadian involvement in the South African War, and he gives an excellent portrayal of the domestic politics, the domestic situation in Canada, but also the military conflict, as especially Canadian troops in South Africa and how that plays out. A great source. The middle book, A War with a Silver Lining, is my book, looking at how Canadian Protestants back in Canada talked about the war, preached about the war, wrote about the war. And so that gives more of a domestic, social, religious history of what the churches back in Canada thought. Another book to look at would be Carl Berger's The Sense of Power. And his book is not about the war itself, it's about the imperial air that everyone breathed in Canada at the time, this sense of being involved in an empire that could give Canada global reach and global influence, the sense of power, sort of draw closer to empire so we have this global reach. And so a very good book to understand the zeitgeist, the spirit of the age, what people lived with at that time. So let's look at causes, and mention of Berger's book is fitting because now we need to get a sense of, we need to travel back to a different time. It's a different world. It's the age of empires, so to speak. And Canada is a part of the British Empire. And you can see this stamp on the screen, published in Canada, 1898, celebrating Canada's central place, as they envision it and hope that it will become, Canada's central place within the empire. And you can see the map as well, the spread of the British Empire, sort of painting the map red with imperial expansion. And we need to understand that this war takes place at this period of surging imperial expansion, especially the British Empire. And so that's the larger context. And so when we look at specific causes, there are many causes. It's a war that doesn't have a single cause, but it is in the context of imperial rivalry. You have in Africa what's coined the scramble for Africa. You have British, you have French, you have German, you have Portuguese, you have this scramble for more territory, and the British are involved in that. Well, the British are expanding north, hoping ultimately to link up its colonies all the way to Egypt. But what's in the way are those two Boer republics. They want to be left out of the imperial rivalry. They've already done their conquests, established their territory. They just want to be left alone. But British expansion and British imperial aims have another perspective on that. And imperial rivalry is important to note as a part of the cause for war. Revenge, the British lost the first Boer War back in 1880 to 1881, very humiliating. And so this aspect of revenge is partly there. It's not why there's war, but it plays a part in how the British are motivated to win this one because they've been humiliated a little over a decade earlier. Gold and diamonds were discovered in the Transvaal and Orange Free State, and that gives a very significant economic motive for going after the Dutch. And the gold and diamonds brought in great wealth into these two Boer republics, but that meant that it was a very appealing target for the British to go after. And so gold and diamonds play a part. The Uitlanders, or the outsiders, gives a sort of moral argument for the British to move in and take over the Boer republics, because these Uitlanders, these outsiders, were migrant workers, most of them British, working in the mines, but they had no citizenship, they had no right to vote or any say in government. And so if you look at our Prime Minister Wilfrid Laurier's comments, you get a sense of how the war is framed in terms of justice. The cause for which you men of Canada are going to fight is the cause of justice, the cause of humanity, of civil rights and religious liberty. Reference there to the Uitlanders, to the outsiders, but also referring to the Africans who are getting a very bad deal under the Boers. This is not a war of conquest. The object is not to crush out the Dutch population, but to establish in that land British sovereign law to assure to all men of that country an equal share of liberty. And so that's how the war is framed, as a war of liberty, not conquest, a war of liberty. And finally, the last point, the causes, actually the British do not declare war. The Boers, seeing the British buildup, figure it's probably wiser to preempt the British invasion by actually invading first. And so they do that, and they move south into British colonies. And so that's the trigger that starts the war. Now, Britain probably would have declared war at some time in the future, but what this does is give the British cause some moral weight, saying, we didn't start the war, you started it, and we're going to finish it. But it's a significant part of piecing together the causes of this war. The conflict itself has three main parts to the conflict. Basically, unbroken Boer victories for a number of months, very humiliating for Britain, the mighty British Empire is being humiliated by these farmers, these militias. This unprofessional army is basically defeating Britain over and over again. And then you have a string of British victories that leads to actually the conquest of and capture of the republics, at least the capital cities of the republics. And then there's a switch to guerrilla warfare. The Boers realize they can't beat Britain in the battlefield. By now, Britain has just overwhelmingly, overwhelmed the Boers with numbers and armament. And so there's a shift to guerrilla warfare, ad hoc, on the run, hit and run raids, that kind of thing. And that's very devastating because the British response is brutal. It's a scorched earth campaign, and there's a rounding up of women and children into camps. And those camps at the beginning are very poorly run. And here you have a portrayal of the British treatment of the Boer women and children. Of course, this is by a critic of the British cause. The camps, the internment camps, concentration camps, whatever you want to call them, actually lead to worldwide global criticism of Britain for its mistreatment of the women and children. And even the British public is made aware of what's going on by a visit of Emily Hobhouse, who writes report War Without Glamour. And the British government is eventually compelled to change the conditions in these camps, but not before tens of thousands of people had died. And so it's a very, very difficult and deadly part of the war. Battle of Parterburg is a famous battle that Canadians fought. We should just note that this was Canada's Vimy Ridge before Vimy Ridge. If you would ask a Canadian before the First World War, what was our famous battle? Most would say Parterburg, because this is a battle where Canadians participate and contribute to one of the earliest British victories. And so Canadians are very proud of the Battle of Parterburg. Then war is finished on the 31st of May in 1902, and you see some images of how the war is proclaimed, or how the peace is proclaimed. It's peace, it's liberty, it's equality for all. And that's how it's portrayed. It doesn't end up being that way, ultimately, as we know the history of South Africa, but that's how the discourse was at the end of the war. Some of the consequences, finally, the death and injury toll is appalling. Britain sent close to 500,000 troops, had 22,000 dead, over 100,000 sick and wounded. So lots of trauma and death and injury to the British. But of course, the Boers experienced over 6,000 deaths, and the devastation of farms, of crops, of buildings, of economy, not to mention the Africans who live in the land, the suffering that they experience, because as the British do a scorched earth policy, they scorch everything. And so you have this generational impact of devastation and death. The Union of South Africa does occur about 8 years later, 1910. The British and the Boers unite to create what eventually becomes this Union of South Africa. It's the introduction of total war. Some argue that the scorched earth policy, the concentration camps, not for annihilation as we think of the Nazi concentration camps, but this targeting of women and children and rounding them up and putting them in internment camps is what some see as sort of steps towards what will become total war in the First World War. It's a war that sparks the fame of Winston Churchill, because he's prisoner at that time. He's taken prisoner and he escapes. He writes about it. He becomes famous. And we know what Churchill will become, a prime minister, famous wartime prime minister, Lord Kitchener, who becomes a victorious general. He also becomes a very important general in the First World War. So you get a few heroes sort of become public figures during the Boer War. The rise of Canadian nationalism and imperialism. This stokes the flames of imperial sentiment among English Protestants in Canada. And so Canadian nationalism for some is tied to empire. And so we just need to note that. Evolution of Canada's foreign policy. This begins to get Canadians thinking about perhaps more of an independent foreign policy. It's not there yet, but over the course of the Boer War, the First World War, and Second World War, that will be a tell-us, that'll be a trajectory. And finally, and lastly, one of the consequences of this war was that it led to serious divisions in Canada. English Protestants in general were excited and enthused about Canada's British imperial connections, but many French Catholics were not, in particular against being involved in imperial wars. And so what takes place in Quebec will be some riots, will be some unrest, and been some divisions that fortunately do not continue to express themselves in violence, but will again be seen in the First World War in conscription. And so you begin to see some patterns developing in the Boer War. And so that's a whirlwind tour of the war, the causes, conflict, and consequences. And if you have questions, happy to deal with those at the question time.
Thank you, Professor Heath. Thank you for giving us a frame to work this live tour. I am going to start by saying that at our museum, we concentrate on the first part of the war, more precisely the February 1900 period, when the balance shifts from the Boer conquest to the British being victorious. And that is because we are going to deal with the first Canadian contingent that eventually the Canadian Parliament approved to join the imperial troops and help with the South African War. There is, in the second part, of course, the second Canadian contingent that is a different unit. It's not the Royal Canadian Regiment, it's more precisely the Canadian Mounted Regiment. So let's go through, and to do so, I will first turn the camera and lead you through the through our exhibit. So as Professor Heath mentioned, the Battle of Parterburg was a turning point during the war. And it is important because henceforth the British start gaining terrain. Now, the Battle of Parterburg so happens that was speared by the 2nd Special Service Battalion, raised in Canada, and under Lieutenant Colonel Arthur's leadership. The Canadians had sailed to South Africa and reached the shores late in 1899. Now, by February, they were marching northeast towards the River Mauser. And you can see here an image of how the Royal Canadians crossed the River Mauser starting 18 February. The battle continued on and off until 27th of February. The Canadians were ordered to advance overnight on the north bank of the Mauser, and they came within 50 yards of the Boer camp, who eventually surrendered in the morning of 28th of February, when Lieutenant Colonel Arthur and his men marched into Cronje's camp. I'm going to continue with a display case where we have a lot of memorabilia from the men who were part of this 1st Canadian contingent or 2nd Special Service Battalion, which, as a side note, was a very successful recruiting effort in Canada, precluding the Canadian Expeditionary Force later on. You can see here the tunic, the type of tunic that was issued to the men, which is a other ranks tunic, British pattern 1899, switching from the famous red coat to the khaki coat, as it was determined the red was too bright on the battlefield, so the men needed some sort of protection. And in addition, a specific badge was struck for them with this type of insignia. You can see in this little shadow box. Also in this display case, you can see the hat that was embroidered by Private Bennett, a member of D Company of the 2nd Special Service Battalion, and he has embroidered the names of all the places they had been through during the campaign. Also, in this display case, we show a Mauser rifle that was used by the war forces, and it has come to our museum directly from the field, being captured by the Royal Canadians. A little farther, you can see 2 medal sets, and it is important to highlight these medal sets. Maybe I'm going to come out so you have a better view of the medal sets. They both medal sets include campaign medals from South Africa. The first one on your left belongs to Lieutenant Colonel Lawless, who was a Royal Canadian infantry member at the beginning of the war. And you can see that he has the Queen and the King's South Africa medal with many bars, the bars meaning the places where he was involved in battle. Lieutenant Colonel Lawless eventually ended up in the Lord Strathcona's regiment, and that shows how multi-unit this first contingent of the Canadian in South Africa was. And the second medal set belonged to David Borland, a regimental sergeant major with the local 7th Fusilier London regiment, and he had seen action in the Northwest Territories, but he also went to South Africa, and he has Parterburg and Bloemfontein bars, and then he moved to Welland and Lincoln Regiment to the First World War. So little bits and pieces of the deployment in South Africa, and we shall continue with a specific image, a very unique image actually, of the officers who participated in the Battle of Parterburg. I'm hoping that the image is clear enough. It shows the officers of the 1st Canadian contingent. It's a unique photo. It was taken in April 1900, just after the engagement at Parterburg, as they were moving north to Bloemfontein, and they reached Bloemfontein. What's very unique about this image is that all the officers have signed it, and it's quite an exercise to decipher all these signatures. Also, as we move on with our little tour here, I am going to point out a few elements. For example, this absent-minded beggar handkerchief. The absent-minded beggar handkerchief was part of a fundraiser that captured the attention throughout the empire. It's based on a poem by Rudyard Kipling, published in the Daily Mail in 1899. And it was immediately turned into a song. Who gave the name of a charitable fund named the Absent-Minded Beggar Relief Corps. And they did raise 250,000 pounds throughout the empire at the time. Even more interesting, a Lee Enfield rifle that belonged to a lance corporal who was part of E Company of the Royal Canadian Infantry Regiment. And it's the regular issue rifle, but Lance Corporal Tweddle has engraved, carved the name of the cities, the places they were during the campaign. And he did a really interesting job with respect to that. And now we are going to move to the table that I prepared with a few archival bits and pieces, just unique testimonials of this important conflict in Canadian military history that tends to be forgotten and doesn't get too much attention. At the time, though, it was very well present in the media. And here we have, because we mentioned Lance Corporal Tweddle, we have 4 diaries that Lance Corporal Tweddle kept, and they are of his campaign in South Africa. In this one, you can see the roll call for E Company, his company. And if we turn the pages, it continues. And over here, this would be the first one. We can see the departure of the contingent with the Sardinian to South Africa. Also, I opened the second diary to 18 February, where he does mention the night march that was very tiring for the troops. And even more interesting, and for the anecdote, at the end of the engagement, before returning to Canada, some of the soldiers of the Royal Canadian Regiment of Infantry, as the regiment was known at the time, did a detour and went to Windsor Castle to salute the Queen. And Tweddle has kept a very detailed account of this visit, including the tickets they took to go to visit Kensington Gardens, to take the electric car, or even to go to Windsor Castle. And here we have a photo of the troops going to Windsor Castle to salute the Queen in what was one of her last public appearances before dying. So we are in November 1900 and the troops are at Windsor Castle. It's a double-sided photograph. So they are now marching into formation. And here is the moment when the Queen comes out in her carriage with the troops looking at her. And finally, I have another item. It's an album that presents the entire South African War conflict. And I opened it to page 62 to show you 2 images of the Canadians in Quebec marching on the streets of Quebec City to board the Sardinian and cross the Atlantic down to South Africa. And with this, we are now ending our tour and talk part of the program. I am just going to check if there are any questions in the chat. All right, so since there are no questions, I am going to thank our guest today, Professor Gordon Heath, for being with us and doing this little walk through our South African War Gallery. Our public programmer who's taken care of the recording, and all those who joined. And please monitor our social media and website for more updates.